Catherine de' Medici entered the world on April 13, 1519, in Florence, cradled by power but born into peril. Her parents, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, both died within weeks of her birth. As an infant, Catherine became an orphan and, more crucially, a political pawn in the dynastic chess game of Renaissance Europe. Yet, despite the Medici family's vast wealth and influence, her early years were marked by instability. The Medici were expelled from Florence in 1527, and young Catherine, then just 8 years old, was taken hostage by anti-Medici factions. She was cloistered in convents and moved between religious institutions, often under threat of assassination or political exploitation. These formative years left psychological scars. Isolated, often surrounded by hostile guards and rival factions, she became fluent in the coded language of survival learning, that appearances could shield ambition, and that silence often preserved power. She absorbed the Renaissance values of learning astrology and esoteric knowledge, but also internalized the Medici tradition of ruling through calculation and fear. Her education under Florentine tutors emphasized not only humanist thought, but also the pragmatic legacy of Machiavelli, who had penned The Prince in her family's orbit. Her fortune turned in 1533 when her uncle Pope Clement VII arranged her marriage to Henry II, son of King Francis I of France. The match intended to bind the papacy, and France was not universally celebrated at the French court. Many viewed Catherine as a banker's daughter, foreign and lowly, her dowry impressive but her blood questioned. Her wedding, though grand, was coldly received by French nobles, and her position remained tenuous. When Henry's elder brother died unexpectedly, Catherine became Dauphine and then queen consort upon Henry's accession in 1547. But her influence remained limited, at least publicly. The early years of her marriage were marked by humiliation. Henry II was emotionally and physically devoted to his powerful mistress Diane de Poitiers, who exerted more political sway than the queen herself. Catherine bore child after child, 10 in total, but still found herself sidelined in both courtly affairs and state matters. Her apparent docility, however, was deceptive. Behind closed doors, she was cultivating connections, studying court dynamics, and collecting information. She was especially drawn to astrologers like Cosimo Ruggieri, whose predictions began to guide her thinking. Her first real grasp of power came only through tragedy. In 1559, during a jousting match staged to celebrate a peace treaty, King Henry II was mortally wounded by a splintered lance. Catherine reportedly forbade doctors from removing the fragment, demanding it be left in his skull until he died. Whether this was grief or something more calculating remains debated. Either way, she assumed a central role at court during his final days, taking control of access to the king and managing the crisis with cold efficiency. When Henry died, Catherine emerged from the shadows. Her eldest son, Francis II, was only 15 and dominated by his wife Mary, Queen of Scots, and the powerful Catholic Guise family. Catherine, though officially only Queen Mother, maneuvered behind the scenes. She presented herself as a grieving matriarch, yet wasted no time asserting her authority. Her son's youth and ill health gave her leverage, and she began assembling a network of informants, clergy, and court bureaucrats loyal to her. A disturbing episode from this period illustrates her early transition into a ruler of fear. When rumors spread that her enemies were plotting to kidnap young Frances Catherine, ordered the nighttime execution of several suspected conspirators. Their bodies were left hanging at dawn from public gallows as a warning. The message was clear: her influence was no longer limited to the nursery. Perhaps most unsettling was her relationship with the occult. Surviving court records and contemporary accounts describe her frequent visits to astrologers and necromancers. Cosimo Ruggieri, her trusted seer, kept her informed with horoscopes and fatalistic predictions. Catherine's chambers reportedly included secret passageways to a hidden astrological observatory complete with rotating planetary models and a ceiling painted with constellations. One tale, possibly apocryphal, claims she once performed a ritual involving the blood of a bat and a wax effigy to protect her son's throne. Yet despite the mysticism, Catherine's power grew not from spells but from strategy. She began cultivating both Catholic and Protestant factions, playing them against each other to preserve her family's reign. The wars of religion had not yet erupted, but tensions were smoldering. Catherine, never overtly loyal to either side, positioned herself as the only figure capable of holding France together. She offered olive branches with one hand and brandished daggers with the other. Her style of governance would become a template for survival politics. Divide enemies, feign weakness, act through proxies. This approach would deepen over the next 2 decades as she ruled through her sons. But in these early moments, her rise was already marked by cold control, psychological complexity, and an unnerving readiness to use fear as a tool of statecraft. The girl once locked behind convent walls had become queen, and the shadows she once feared were now her greatest allies. Catherine de' Medici did not wear a crown of her own, but she learned to govern as though she had. Following the death of her husband Henry II and the short, sickly reign of her eldest son, Francis II, who died at just 16, Catherine found herself again at a crossroads. The throne passed to her 10-year-old son, Charles IX. In legal terms, this made Catherine merely the queen mother. In practice, it made her the regent of France. From 1560 onward, she ruled not as a monarch by blood, but as a strategist who operated in the corridors, not on the throne. And it was in these corridors, lined with tapestries and stalked by spies, that Catherine's political instincts reached their fullest expression. She moved carefully, building a court around her that blended diplomacy, intelligence, and fear. France at the time was a nation on the verge of fracturing. The Protestant Reformation had taken hold among the nobility and urban classes, and the Catholic elite feared the erosion of its power. Catherine, pragmatic to the core, did not align herself ideologically with either camp. Instead, she oscillated between conciliation and intimidation. She invited Protestants to court, occasionally entertained their demands, and even proposed religious compromise. But each conciliatory gesture was followed by calculated retaliation, as if testing the limits of tolerance. Her son Charles IX, though king in name, was deeply insecure and easily swayed. Catherine quickly recognized his psychological vulnerabilities and used them to assert control. Reports from court insiders describe how Catherine routinely excluded Charles from key decisions, then presented them to him as fate's accomplice. She maintained his dependency by reinforcing his fears of rebellion, of assassination, and of betrayal, fears often inflated or manufactured. Contemporary records suggest that Catherine oversaw a vast intelligence network. Courtiers were recruited as informants. Chambermaids were tasked with eavesdropping. Ambassadors abroad received secret instructions directly from the Queen Mother. It was through this web of surveillance that Catherine governed, acting not as a figure of majesty but as a presence that haunted every room. Her style of rule extended beyond court mechanics and into psychological terrain. She had learned from her own marginalization that visible power provokes resistance. So she chose to wield invisible power, quiet, pervasive, and unnerving. Nobles were never quite sure if Catherine knew their secrets, but they often behaved as though she did. Perhaps the most chilling example of this psychological manipulation occurred in 1561, when Catherine summoned both Catholic and Protestant leaders to a religious colloquy at Poissy. The aim was to ease tensions, perhaps even to draft a plan for toleration. But Catherine made sure the meeting room was adorned with faded medieval frescoes of damnation bodies, writhing in hellfire demons devouring heretics. Officially, this was coincidence. Unofficially, it was Catherine's subtle reminder of the cost of disobedience. During these years, she also began using art and architecture as instruments of soft power. Portraits of her sons were commissioned to emphasize piety, masculinity, and divine right, carefully composed images meant to veil their weaknesses. Catherine herself cultivated an aura of maternal wisdom in public, while quietly employing court painters to portray her as stately and eternal, draped in black like a secular sibyl. But her court was not serene. Factional rivalries intensified, and Catherine responded by institutionalizing division. She placed enemies in overlapping positions of influence, creating a system in which everyone was dependent on her favor to survive. This strategy, ingenious though it was, bred paranoia. Ministers came to fear their secretaries. Ambassadors suspected their own aides. Few could act without worrying that Catherine had already anticipated and countered their moves. Her authority reached a peak in 1563, when Charles IX was formally declared of age. Although this technically ended her regency, Catherine retained full control over state affairs. The young king, already emotionally fragile, was content to defer to her judgment. Catherine understood the symbolic value of his presence, but she made the actual decisions over wars, treaties, and domestic policy. By this point, her identity as ruler was no longer questioned. She had become a queen without the crown, an architect of policy, whose name was whispered rather than proclaimed. Yet this omnipresence came at a cost. Public sentiment turned suspicious. Pamphlets began to circulate accusing her of necromancy, murder, and incest. Some claimed she had poisoned political rivals. Others accused her of manipulating childbirths to switch royal infants at birth. One such pamphlet, printed in Geneva in 1565, depicted Catherine as a sorceress presiding over a nocturnal ritual, sacrificing a goat beneath a bleeding crucifix. The image was absurd, but the fear was real. Catherine had become both essential and terrifying a ruler, whose legitimacy lay not in law or bloodline, but in her ability to control the uncontrollable. What drove Catherine to such extremes? Some modern historians argue it was desperation, a woman surrounded by enemies in a male-dominated world, using the only tools available. But contemporaries rarely offered such sympathy. To many, Catherine represented a cold new form of rule, one driven not by vision or virtue, but by calculation and survival instinct. And yet, for all the fear she inspired, Catherine managed to delay France's descent into full civil war for nearly a decade. She juggled alliances, manipulated foreign powers, and kept her sons on the throne. Her grip was not gentle, but it was effective. Her court remained an uneasy mix of elegance and terror, an unstable equilibrium that masked a brewing catastrophe. The cracks, however, were beginning to show. Catherine de' Medici's ability to hold France together hinged not only on her intelligence, but also on her control over her children. And in this she would find both her greatest tool and her deepest vulnerability. With Charles IX formally recognized as king, but utterly dependent on her, Catherine began exercising her power through a regency in all but name. Her children, one by one, became political chess pieces on a blood-stained board. Her governance took on an increasingly personal tone as she inserted herself into every aspect of royal life. Charles was watched constantly. He was kept isolated from powerful advisors who might influence him independently, and surrounded instead by figures loyal to his mother. Even his private letters were sometimes intercepted by Catherine's agents. At court, she cultivated the image of the dutiful mother, but behind that image was a tireless campaign to ensure her absolute dominance over the monarchy. This obsessive control extended to her other children. Her daughters were married off with almost clinical precision, each match calculated to strengthen ties with France's ever-shifting allies. Elizabeth was married to Philip II of Spain. Marguerite, later known as Queen Margot, was offered to Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot leader, in a move Catherine hoped would bridge the religious divide in France. The wedding, as history would grimly show, would do the opposite. Her younger sons, Henry and François, were groomed as successors in the event of Charles's death. She commissioned elaborate horoscopes to track their destinies. When court astrologers predicted misfortune, Catherine had been known to postpone key decisions, delay marriages, or even consult necromancers in secret. The occult had become woven into her routine. Cosimo Ruggeri, still her favored astrologer, held private sessions with her in chambers sealed from the court, and his predictions held eerie sway over her scheduling of royal ceremonies and diplomatic missions. In 1567, the psychological toll of Catherine's rule began to surface more visibly. Rumors swirled about a failed plot to assassinate the Queen Mother, prompting her to order sweeping arrests. Dozens of Protestant nobles were detained without trial. Some were tortured, others vanished entirely. One servant captured trying to flee the Louvre was said to have had his tongue removed before being quietly executed. These were not state-sanctioned trials, they were acts of intimidation carried out in the legal gray zones that Catherine had mastered. This period also marked a disturbing expansion of her intelligence apparatus. Catherine's court became infamous for its secrecy and paranoia. She employed a network of informants, including physicians, perfumers, and even laundresses. The Queen Mother was said to read the intercepted letters of her enemies while they slept. Historians have uncovered court expenditures that suggest entire wings of the palace were devoted to coded correspondence surveillance operations and secret rooms accessible only by hidden panels. Among the most unsettling of these tactics was the use of children as instruments of control. Catherine reportedly had her younger sons sleep in chambers adjacent to her own, well into their teenage years. This practice she claimed was for their protection. But behind closed doors, it ensured her uninterrupted access to their thoughts, fears, and intentions. She would read aloud to them at night from religious texts and apocalyptic treatises, instilling a sense of duty intertwined with doom. Charles IX, for his part, became increasingly unstable. Letters and memoirs from courtiers describe a monarch prone to fits of rage, sudden tears, and near-delusional paranoia. Some believed he was suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia or syphilitic madness. Others blamed his mother's relentless pressure. Catherine responded by tightening her grip. She limited his public appearances, vetted his advisors, and increased her consultations with astrologers. An incident from 1568 reveals the chilling nature of their relationship. After Charles ordered the arrest of a Protestant noble without Catherine's approval, she burst into his council chamber and struck him in front of the entire court. The king, then 18, reportedly broke down in tears, apologizing profusely. Catherine later dismissed the episode as motherly discipline. But to witnesses, it was a public demonstration that the King of France was not truly sovereign. Still, Catherine's power was not limitless. Her overreach began to breed resentment among Catholics and Protestants alike. The Huguenots accused her of duplicity, offering negotiations with one hand while imprisoning their leaders with the other. Hardcore Catholics, especially the Guise faction, saw her compromises as heresy. The court, once terrified into loyalty, began to fracture under the weight of competing hatreds. At the center of it all, Catherine remained calm outwardly, but privately signs of strain began to surface. She took to wearing mourning black, almost exclusively a visual symbol of piety that also cast her as a kind of living widow of the French throne. Her personal library expanded to include grim works on alchemy, prophecy, and death rituals. Servants reported seeing her wandering the halls at night, muttering prayers in Latin and clutching religious relics. One particularly grotesque episode preserved in an obscure 17th century account tells of Catherine conducting a mock trial in her private chambers against a wax effigy of a Protestant leader. She stabbed it with a jeweled dagger and ordered it burned. Whether symbolic or deranged, such rituals underscore the degree to which statecraft and superstition had fused in her rule. And yet in this atmosphere of darkness and control, Catherine still maintained an undeniable efficiency. Civil war had not yet erupted. The monarchy still stood. And though the young Charles IX was visibly deteriorating, he remained on the throne largely thanks to the scaffolding his mother had built around him. But that scaffolding was beginning to buckle. Factional resentment was peaking. Religious tensions were about to explode. And Catherine's next move, an effort to unite the country through a wedding, would become the prelude to one of the most infamous bloodbaths in French history. The marriage of Marguerite de Valois to Henry of Navarre in August 1572 was meant to symbolize peace. Catherine de Medici, ever the strategist, orchestrated the union between her Catholic daughter and the leading Protestant prince in France as a calculated gamble to stabilize the kingdom. It was to be a grand reconciliation, a moment that would bind two fractured halves of the kingdom. Instead, it triggered one of the most horrific massacres in French history and left a permanent stain on Catherine's legacy. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Paris was tense. Thousands of Huguenots had entered the capital to witness the union. They came unarmed in good faith, trusting the court's promises of security. The streets were crowded with Protestant nobles, some of whom were high-ranking military commanders. The Catholic Parisians, however, viewed their presence as an invasion. Rumors swirled. Angry sermons in local churches called for resistance. Placards appeared in alleyways comparing the Huguenots to serpents nesting in the king's house. Catherine, as always, monitored everything. Her spies filled the taverns. Her informants sent daily reports. And yet in the most crucial hours, she either lost control or, worse, directed events toward a deliberate purge. The trigger came days after the wedding. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent Huguenot leader and one of the key architects of peace with the crown, was shot in the street by a hired assassin. He survived barely, but the Huguenots were outraged. They suspected Catholic hardliners at court, perhaps even the Guise family. Tensions boiled. Coligny's survival posed a problem for Catherine. He was gaining influence over Charles IX, who had begun to see the Protestant leader as a father figure. Catherine feared losing her grip. In this context, she held a series of secret meetings with members of the royal council and the Guise faction. What was discussed remains uncertain, but the result was unmistakable. In the early hours of August 24th of 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day church bells tolled across Paris. Armed bands led by royal guards descended on Protestant households. The slaughter began with Coligny himself, who was dragged from his bed, stabbed repeatedly, and thrown from a window. His corpse was mutilated and paraded through the streets. From there, the massacre spread like fire. Protestants were hacked apart in their beds, murdered in the streets, drowned in the Seine. Windows shattered as mobs pulled entire families into the open. Eyewitnesses describe priests absolving killers mid-attack. Babies were impaled on pikes. Pregnant women were disemboweled. The Seine reportedly turned red with blood and clogged with bodies. In one horrific case, a Huguenot noblewoman who had hidden in a convent was discovered and burned alive alongside the nuns who had protected her. Catherine, when informed of the carnage, did not intervene. She had already ordered the city gates closed to prevent escape. The killings continued for days, spreading beyond Paris to other cities: Orléans, Lyon, Toulouse, Rouen. The death toll is estimated between 5,000 and 30,000 across France. Charles IX, still mentally fragile, descended into horror. According to court chroniclers, he was awakened on the first night by screams and rushed to Catherine trembling. She reportedly told him, "It is better to kill the serpents now than let them hatch." In the following days, he suffered violent mood swings, episodes of vomiting and hallucinations. He later confessed, "What evil counsel have I followed? God forgive me, I am lost." Catherine worked quickly to control the narrative. She organized religious ceremonies to thank God for the deliverance of the crown. Foreign ambassadors were told the killings were a preemptive strike against a Protestant conspiracy. Inside France, royal proclamations framed the massacre as a defensive measure. But the damage was irreversible. Internationally, Catherine became a symbol of cruelty and duplicity. Protestant nations denounced her as a butcher queen. In England, pamphlets circulated that showed her bathing in Protestant blood. In Geneva, sermons condemned her as the Jezebel of France. Even Catholic allies expressed quiet disgust at the scale and savagery of the massacre. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy was the psychological shift it caused in French society. The massacre revealed that religious violence was not just a possibility, it was now an accepted instrument of state policy. Trust between Catholics and Protestants was shattered. Reconciliation became nearly impossible. Catherine had hoped to create peace through control. Instead, she had legitimized mass murder as a form of governance. And in doing so, she alienated both allies and enemies. Her image as the cool, calculating matriarch gave way to something more monstrous, a ruler who, when threatened, was willing to drown her own capital in blood. The fallout at court was severe. Protestant nobles who survived the massacre were either imprisoned, exiled, or forced to convert. Marguerite's marriage to Henry of Navarre remained legally intact, but the couple despised each other. Henry himself, held under house arrest for years, was forced to feign Catholicism to stay alive. Catherine, meanwhile, continued to dominate the political scene, but the stains of August 1572 could not be scrubbed away. She resumed her consultations with astrologers and reportedly ordered the creation of a secret book of omens, a compendium of portents, prophecies, and astrological alignments meant to prevent further disaster. Her reliance on mysticism deepened even as her rational grip on politics weakened. Most chilling of all were the celebrations she staged in the massacre's aftermath. Court banquets were held. Fireworks lit up the night sky. Musicians played under banners that read "Peace and Unity," while the corpses of the slain still rotted in the streets. To Catherine, it seems horror was simply another tool in the preservation of power. But power once rooted in blood begins to decay. Catherine had secured the monarchy for now, but at a cost that France would pay for generations. Even as the streets of Paris dried and the echoes of screams faded, Catherine de' Medici's court grew darker. No longer content with merely pulling the strings of power, she transformed her surroundings into an engine of control, indulgence, and fear. It was during this period after the massacre and in the waning years of Charles IX's reign that her court reached its most bizarre and sinister form, defined by two of its most infamous elements: poison and seduction. Catherine had long been associated with the art of subtle elimination. While hard evidence of direct involvement in poisonings remains scarce, contemporary reports and later accounts describe a court riddled with mysterious deaths, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable symptoms. Her reliance on perfume makers and apothecaries, particularly those from Italy, fed the belief that she maintained a private laboratory for crafting toxic substances. A particularly infamous figure was René le Florentin, her personal perfumer who was rumored to have created scented gloves jewelry and even books laced with lethal compounds. The most disturbing case tied to these whispers was that of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, and a staunch Protestant. She died suddenly in 1572 after visiting Paris to arrange her son Henry's marriage to Catherine's daughter. Many suspected she had been poisoned by a pair of gloves or a gift of perfumed sweets. No proof was ever found, but the timing was damning. Jeanne's death removed one of the few remaining Protestant monarchs in Europe just days before the wedding that sparked the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. But poison wasn't Catherine's only means of influence. Equally potent was her flying squadron, l'Escadron Volant, a notorious corps of elegant, educated, and strategically seductive women, trained to gather intelligence, manipulate powerful men, and shift alliances through intimacy. These ladies-in-waiting weren't simply ornaments. They were weapons. Dispatched to charm ambassadors, noblemen, and even Catherine's own sons, they served as her eyes, ears, and leverage in an increasingly treacherous court. The existence of this female espionage unit reflected Catherine's deeper understanding of how court politics functioned. In a realm where men dominated warfare and statecraft, she carved out a separate arena of influence, one rooted in intimacy allure and calculated vulnerability. Members of the flying squadron were often married off to key allies, or lords she needed to monitor. They were expected to report pillow talk rivalries and secret plots. Their success stories are scattered across court memoirs, often in hushed tones or scandalous footnotes. Yet this strategy came at a psychological cost. The court began to eat itself. Nobles distrusted each other, fearing that any encounter, romantic or casual, might be a trap. Affairs of the heart became matters of state. One incident involved a young nobleman who, convinced he was being manipulated by one of Catherine's women, stabbed himself in the thigh to cut out the lust he believed had been planted by witchcraft. Catherine herself remained physically distant, increasingly veiled and reserved. She took to wearing mourning black almost exclusively, reinforcing her image as both grieving mother and Gothic ruler. Her chambers were filled with portraits of her dead children, symbolic talismans, and religious relics. Some visitors reported the eerie presence of animal bones on her writing desk, allegedly used in astrological readings. Cosimo Ruggieri continued to hold private audiences with her, and according to a cryptic letter preserved in the Vatican archives, he once claimed to have raised a shade for the Queen, a veiled reference to necromancy. Charles IX, meanwhile, was disintegrating. Haunted by the massacre, plagued by coughing fits and bloody sputum, he fell into despair. His health collapsed, as did his mental state. Eyewitnesses recalled him screaming at invisible enemies, accusing Catherine of poisoning him, then sobbing into her lap hours later. He died in 1574 at age 23, reportedly after days of hemorrhaging from the lungs, a scene so gruesome that even hardened courtiers were shaken. Catherine wept publicly, but in private she moved swiftly. Within days she secured the succession for her favorite son Henry, then serving as King of Poland. She arranged his return to France and the quiet removal of rivals from key posts. As always, she moved faster than her enemies. But not all threats could be poisoned or seduced. The Guise family, powerful ultra-Catholics, began building their own counterweight to Catherine's influence. The Protestant Huguenots, though crippled, were not extinguished, and the common people, increasingly impoverished by war and taxation, began whispering legends about the Queen Mother tales of midnight sacrifices, hidden dungeons, and ghostly apparitions inside the Louvre. What Catherine had built an empire of loyalty enforced by paranoia was becoming unsustainable. The court was now a spectacle of Gothic intrigue. Diplomats from other kingdoms wrote home of their unease, the silence in the halls, the veiled glances, the smell of incense masking something fouler. One English envoy compared Catherine's presence to that of a marionette master who does not dance but watches. Another noted that none dare speak in jest within her hearing, for one cannot know if her jest will be your death. And yet, even as fear gripped the court, Catherine still maintained a facade of order. She continued to commission lavish festivals to promote the arts to sponsor scientific inquiries. The contradictions were glaring: a queen who advanced Renaissance culture while relying on medieval fear, a patron of beauty whose court reeked of suspicion. Through poisoned seduction and ritualized manipulation, Catherine had managed to keep the French monarchy afloat. But the foundation beneath her was cracking, and she would soon find that even the most carefully orchestrated court cannot survive the collapse of belief in its legitimacy. By the late 1570s, Catherine de' Medici was no longer just a feared matriarch. She had become a symbol of everything wrong with the French crown. Her iron control had kept civil war at bay for nearly 2 decades, but the facade was eroding. Rumors of her occult practices, manipulations, and court of spies had spilled beyond the chateau into the streets. What once inspired awe now bred open hostility. The Protestant Huguenots had not been eradicated by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They had hardened. Rebellions broke out in the south, entire towns refused royal authority, and local nobles took up arms once more. At the same time, ultra-Catholic factions, particularly the House of Guise, began to position themselves not only against Protestants, but against the Valois crown itself. The strategy of balancing opposites, which Catherine had mastered for so long, was now backfiring. By 1576, Catherine was presiding over a kingdom split in 3 Huguenots, who demanded full religious freedom: Catholics who sought their annihilation, and moderates who wanted peace but were increasingly drowned out by violence. Her answer was the Edict of Beaulieu, a sweeping concession to the Huguenots that allowed public worship and access to royal offices. Predictably, this alienated the Catholic League. What followed was chaos. Catholic mobs rioted. Huguenot leaders were attacked in broad daylight. Paris itself became a city under siege, not by foreign armies, but by its own factions. Catherine found herself no longer feared but ignored. Where once a whispered threat from the Queen Mother had stopped conspiracies cold, now even minor nobles openly defied her. A Spanish ambassador reported that the Queen Mother speaks with her old authority, but none listen. She attempted to reassert control by traveling again, something she had done frequently in earlier years to assert her presence across France. But now her appearances inspired less loyalty than revulsion. In Limoges, a group of children sang a mocking rhyme about her poisoned gloves. In Tours, townspeople refused to ring church bells in her honor. Even her once loyal spies returned reports of nobles referring to her as the Black Widow. Worse still were the grotesque rumors. Pamphlets printed in Protestant strongholds described Catherine as a literal witch. Some claimed she bathed in the blood of children to preserve her youth. Others said she kept the skulls of murdered Protestants in her personal chapel. These were fabrications, of course, but they reflected a deeper truth. Catherine no longer inspired political respect. She inspired dread, resentment, and loathing. Foreign relations, too, had soured. England's Queen Elizabeth I viewed Catherine with suspicion, especially after the massacre. Spain's Philip II, while nominally allied through Catholicism, distrusted her vacillating policies. Even the papacy, once a Medici stronghold, had distanced itself. Catherine, once the linchpin of European diplomacy, was now seen as erratic and morally bankrupt. One grotesque incident in 1578 further damaged her standing. During a lavish court celebration in Blois, a nobleman collapsed after drinking from a gold chalice meant for a toast. He convulsed violently and died the next morning. Whispers immediately blamed poison, and though no investigation followed, the court froze. Catherine was seen leaving the event in haste, her black gown rustling like a death shroud. The corpse was buried quietly with no ceremony. Amid these unraveling threads, Catherine doubled down on her reliance on omens and ritual. She consulted Ruggieri almost daily, reportedly demanding he chart the future of each of her sons using multiple zodiac systems. She had a secret chamber at the Château de Chaumont, converted into an astrological observatory, complete with enchanted mirrors and occult manuscripts smuggled from Florence. A Venetian diplomat later described the chamber as a library fit for a necromancer. She also grew increasingly obsessive over her physical decline. Portraits from this period depict her with sunken eyes, gaunt cheeks, and skeletal fingers clutching rosaries. Court physicians prescribed powders and tonics to combat fatigue and melancholy. But the more Catherine aged, the more desperate her rituals became. She wore talismans under her bodice and carried a small glass vial, its contents unknown, said to ward off curses. Most disturbingly, Catherine took to visiting the corpses of her dead children in the royal crypt. On at least 3 documented occasions, she entered the tombs at night, accompanied only by a priest and 1 or 2 guards. These were not state-sanctioned acts of mourning, they were private pilgrimages. Witnesses claim she spoke aloud to the coffins, asking for guidance. One priest wrote in a private journal that she once said, "Charles still whispers. He is not done." Whether this was grief or delusion is difficult to say. Her relationship with her remaining sons was no less tortured. Henry III, now king, was arrogant, flamboyant, and openly disdainful of his mother's advice. Catherine found herself sidelined. Her letters often ignored her influence over appointments diminished. Though she remained a formal advisor, she was no longer the true power behind the throne, and yet she refused to leave. She attended every council meeting, traveled relentlessly, and hosted foreign diplomats with rehearsed charm. She knew the crown's survival depended not on legitimacy but on perception, and as long as she remained in motion, the illusion of control endured. But inside, she must have sensed the truth. Her legacy was crumbling, her enemies were multiplying, and the monarchy she had protected so fiercely was now a sickly heir away from total collapse. In her final years of active rule, Catherine resembled less a queen and more a shadow, a walking emblem of power past its expiration, still sharp, but no longer feared, still moving, but no longer obeyed. The world was changing, and she was becoming its ghost. Henry III's reign marked the beginning of Catherine de' Medici's true eclipse. Though still physically present in court and often consulted, she was no longer the central axis around which policy revolved. Her youngest surviving son, crowned in 1574, after Charles IX's death, was flamboyant, secretive, and erratic, intensely Catholic, yet curiously disinterested in the rigid doctrines of the Catholic League. He had no interest in continuing his mother's balancing act between Protestant and Catholic factions. Nor did he inherit her discipline. Catherine had hoped to guide him as she had Charles and Francis before him, but Henry proved defiant in ways she had not anticipated. He surrounded himself with favorites known as les mignons, young aristocratic men who mimicked his dress and speech and held immense influence at court. Catherine despised them, calling them frivolous, disruptive, and dangerous. Her warnings, however, fell on deaf ears. Henry's court became infamous for its decadence. Balls, masks, and costumed feasts replaced statecraft. Catherine, meanwhile, watched the growing chasm between the crown and its increasingly radicalized subjects with alarm. The kingdom had become a tinderbox. The Catholic League, led by the powerful Guise family, was gaining traction. The Huguenots still wounded but not defeated organized militias in the countryside. Henry seemed more concerned with aesthetics than diplomacy. Catherine, ever the operator, tried to reinsert herself. She traveled across France again, playing the royal peacemaker. In 1585, she personally negotiated with Protestant leaders in the south, despite being nearly 70 and often in ill health. Her goal was to broker a truce and present Henry III as a unifying figure. But each journey revealed how little remained of her former stature. In one town, she was greeted by silence. In another, her carriage was pelted with eggs. The fear she had once commanded had withered into mockery. Even more disturbing was her increasing reliance on omens and astrological signs. According to court chroniclers, Catherine refused to sign royal edicts unless the date was astrologically auspicious. She also began to issue instructions to her staff based on dreams, believing her deceased sons were sending her guidance from beyond the grave. One of her most unsettling rituals took place in 1587 at Chenonceau, the chateau she had transformed into her personal retreat. It was here that she hosted a secret midnight mass in the castle's chapel, barred from public entry, lit only by candlelight, and attended by her most trusted inner circle. In place of the Eucharist, small wafers inscribed with astrological symbols were reportedly distributed. The officiating priest later disappeared, never to be seen again. Whether this event was a cryptic political gesture or a descent into superstition is unclear, but it exemplified how far Catherine had drifted from the political norms she once manipulated with ease. Meanwhile, her relationship with Henry III deteriorated further. He resented her constant interference and had grown weary of the accusations that he was still ruled by his mother. In one volatile council meeting, he allegedly snapped, "I am king now. Let me fall on my own sword if I must." Catherine was said to have gone pale, then replied coldly, "Then sharpen it, my son." The exchange was witnessed by several nobles and circulated widely, yet another sign that the dynasty was tearing itself apart. By 1588, Henry's political failures had emboldened the Guise faction to seize power outright. That December, after an attempted coup by the Catholic League in Paris, Henry had the Duke of Guise assassinated in cold blood during a council session. The Cardinal of Guise was murdered the next day. The killings shocked even Catherine. Though no stranger to political violence, she had always veiled her actions with plausible deniability. Henry had committed regicide in all but name, and broken the already fragile trust between the monarchy and its people. Catherine was devastated. She had spent her life ensuring that royal authority was preserved through fear, not frenzy. The assassinations were reckless, overt, and terminally destabilizing. When she confronted Henry, he allegedly dismissed her with the words, "You built a kingdom of shadows. I am merely snuffing the lamps." Emotionally shattered, Catherine withdrew from politics almost entirely. Her letters from this period show a woman no longer maneuvering but mourning. She wrote of recurring nightmares of her sons turning into wolves and tearing each other apart. One private journal entry possibly dictated reads, "I fed the throne with my body, my blood, my soul, and yet it is cursed." She became reclusive, rarely leaving her chambers at Blois. Reports from courtiers mention her talking to portraits, refusing to eat unless food was tasted 3 times, and obsessively rereading old horoscopes. She no longer wore her signature mourning black, instead choosing deep purples and dark green, a subtle return to the Medici colors of her childhood, perhaps a final symbolic retreat into memory. In her final weeks, she suffered from painful inflammation in her legs, possibly caused by gout or untreated infection. Her physical decay paralleled the monarchy's stiff, swollen, and nearing collapse. When a Catholic League delegation arrived in Blois to demand her son's abdication, she refused to meet them. She knew the end was near not just for herself, but for the Valois dynasty. On January 5th, 1589, Catherine de' Medici died at the age of 69. No royal bells were rung. Her funeral was modest, hastily arranged due to the political crisis. Even her burial was incomplete. A few months later, the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where her body was interred, was overrun by radical Catholic mobs. Her tomb was desecrated, her coffin opened, her remains scattered. The queen who ruled through fear was cast into oblivion by the very chaos she once controlled. She had outlived her children, her allies, and her legacy. And in the end, France stood no closer to unity than when she first seized power. Death did not bring Catherine de' Medici peace, nor did it close the chapter of France's agony. Just 6 months after her burial was desecrated, her final son, King Henry III, was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic while preparing for battle outside Paris. With no legitimate heirs, the Valois dynasty, France's ruling house for over 2 centuries, was extinguished. What Catherine had spent a lifetime propping up through marriages, massacres, and machinations collapsed in a single blow. The Bourbon line ascended to the throne soon after, with Henry of Navarre, her former son-in-law and one-time prisoner, becoming King Henry IV. A Protestant by birth who had converted to Catholicism to secure his crown, he would later declare Paris is well worth a mass. It was a decision Catherine herself might have admired, cold, pragmatic, and above all effective. But by then, Catherine's legacy had already calcified into legend and infamy. The destruction of her tomb at Saint-Denis in 1793 during the French Revolution sealed her fate not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol. Her bones, like those of many French royals, were dumped into a mass grave. Her epitaph erased her image, vilified in both Catholic and Protestant memory. To the revolutionaries, she was just another tyrant. To Protestant chroniclers of the 17th century, she remained the Black Queen, the Jezebel of France, or worse, the Serpent of the Valois. But her fall had begun long before revolutionaries wielded pickaxes. It began in the corridors of the Louvre, where she ruled through whispers and arranged deaths. It began with the surveillance states. She pioneered the sexual espionage she deployed, and the calculated psychological warfare she waged on her own children. It began when her quest for control overtook any vision of peace, and it climaxed in that final descent, a mother surrounded by graves, a queen stripped of power, a body desecrated and forgotten. The horror of her fall lies not only in its physical violence, but in its profound isolation. Despite years of dominion, Catherine died without loyalty, reverence, or legacy. Her power had been rooted in fear, and when that fear lifted, so too did any semblance of protection. And yet to dismiss her as merely monstrous is to ignore the impossible context she inhabited, a foreign-born woman, ruling in a deeply patriarchal court, navigating the most volatile religious conflict in Europe, raising 10 children while holding together a kingdom that fractured the moment she released her grip. Her ruthlessness was not born of vanity but of necessity. Her cruelty in her own eyes may have been Mercy's grim twin. Still, the results were undeniable. She left a France disillusioned, traumatized, and directionless. Her children died young or violently. Her dynasty crumbled. Her name became a warning. In the end, Catherine de' Medici ruled through fear, but her fall proved that fear once spent leaves nothing behind but silence. The story of Catherine de' Medici is one of grim endurance. Born into political chaos, orphaned as an infant, and married into suspicion, she climbed to the summit of French power through sheer will, intellect, and adaptability. But what she built, a monarchy sustained by fierce surveillance and violence, could never endure. Her downfall and that of her children was not the result of one fatal mistake, but of decades spent governing a kingdom too fractured to be healed by manipulation alone. In retrospect, Catherine's life is both a cautionary tale and a grim study in political necessity. Her tactics, psychological control, calculated marriages, targeted assassinations, strategic concessions bought the Valois crown time, but at a staggering cost. France emerged from her shadow exhausted, more fractured than unified, and permanently changed in how it viewed authority, religion, and royal legitimacy. Yet her legacy is more complex than her reputation as a poisoner or puppet master suggests. She was a patron of the arts, a champion of architecture, and a builder of gardens and libraries. She presided over one of the most intellectually vibrant courts in Europe. And at a time when few women held formal power, she maintained command over one of Europe's most volatile kingdoms for over 30 years longer than many kings. Still, these nuances were lost to history's first interpreters, who found in Catherine a convenient villain. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of her legacy. She built a kingdom from shadows, and in the end was consumed by them. She died with no dynasty to carry her banner, no public to mourn her, and no monuments that survived the fury of revolution. Her name survives not as a queen, but as a myth, distorted, darkened, and deeply feared. In the quiet that followed her death, France staggered toward a new age. The wars of religion would grind on, but the monarchy she had preserved through terror would be reborn under a new dynasty. And as the Bourbon kings rose, they did so on the bones and memory of a queen who ruled not with love or law, but with the quiet, enduring force of fear.